So I know we don't often read the Bible here, but it's Easter, so I assume you'll forgive me. We aim to honor all of the sources of our faith, of which the Bible is certainly one. But if you're unfamiliar with the Easter story, let me do a quick recap of what happened. Due to Jesus's rowdy rabble-rousing, calling the priests out on their treatment of the poor, discussing the occupation of Jerusalem, flipping over the tables in the temples and calling out the money changers, and losing his mind disparaging the rich, because he literally upended the status quo of what people thought someone like him should do, Jesus of Nazareth was killed. The people in power, the government, the police nailed him to a cross where he died an excruciating death, as an example for all those who might question authority. And those who loved him, his mother, his possible lover, Mary Magdalene, his friends, cried out in grief at the death of a man who had helped them see a different way to be in the world. And then a few days later, on this Easter Sunday, he appeared to his friends as a new person. And Mary Magdalene, his friend and possible lover, didn't even recognize him. She literally looks at him in this passage and doesn't realize it's him. She spent these past few days grieving for this person she's been so close to. And when he reappears changed, she doesn't at first realize who it is. But he does tell her and asks her to tell all his friends about his change, that he has been resurrected as a new being. He is taking on a new identity, or perhaps more true to who he's always been. Yes, perhaps Jesus is coming out of the closet. Tomb. He is presenting himself directly to Mary after she and all of his friends have begun grieving who he was. He's gone through a transformation, a change from one thing to another, something that is hard for some of his loved ones to understand or even to believe, but one that is celebrated as the most holy day of the Christian calendar, Easter Sunday. Is it a stretch to see Jesus' death and resurrection as an allegory for the suffering and triumph of transness in our world? After all, biblical scholars Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan tell us Jesus did not die for the sins of the world. He was killed because of the sins of the world. As a Unitarian Universalist who believes in creating the most beautiful world and the most equitable world and the most justice-filled world we can here on earth, I don't believe that the suffering and death of Jesus was inevitable, just as I don't believe that the suffering of transgender people is. But his rebirth, his triumph in the face of it, that is queer. That is trans. To notice, to celebrate, in spite of the sins of the world, we are still here. Our trans joy is still here. Transgender people still come out and are loved and are celebrated like we are celebrating today. As many of you know, I'm a transgender man. And something about this story resonates with me and my own experience of coming out. You see, I realized as I was preparing this service, this crossover between Easter and the Transgender Day of Visibility, which is today, I realized that I have never given a sermon in all my 7 years here about my trans journey. Sure, I've mentioned it, but I've never focused on it, which was actually a surprise to me. I think I've been afraid of being labeled the trans minister, which is interesting, right? When I was called or hired here, things were different. It was a lot harder for ministers, even Unitarian Universalist ministers who were transgender, to get a job. It was news in Boston that I was called here. Here, I'm going to play you a short clip of when I was on the news. These people
Minister is
remember
getting
this,
ready
that
to
were
lead
around?
his first service at one of the oldest churches in New England.
But he's breaking new ground as the church's first openly transgender minister. Alicia Palumbo caught up with him in Malden.
the folks in the congregation have been so warm and welcoming.
At just 32 years old, Reverend Otto O'Connor may not seem to some to be a traditional minister, but it's not his age that makes his unanimous selection this summer as settled minister of the First Parish in Malden Unitarian Universalist
Unique.
Church.
You can stop it now. Remember when I had hair? But kind of like when you watch that, you're like, who cares? Like, it's a trans minister. Like, who cares, right? I don't think this would make the news now, right? Like, Boston news, big deal. But back then, I actually lost out on jobs because I was transgender. And since that time, a lot of people who've come to this church have assumed that it's because of me that this church is so LGBTQ plus and particularly trans inclusive, but it's not. This church called me, and that was a symptom of who you already were. A bold move that recognized that I, as a transgender person, could be a minister. A revolutionary story at the time. And in many parts of the world, it still would be. So that's all to say that after 7 years, I'm finally ready to tell you my story of rebirth on this day that celebrates resurrection. Now, my story of being trans is not everyone's story of being trans, but it's not uncommon either. When I was a kid, not too long after the doctors announced it's a girl when I was born, I wondered what life would have been like if I had been born a boy. I wished for it sometimes, but I never imagined it would be possible. So I tried to live my life as a girl, and it was mostly fine, until I realized I was having crushes on girls, something that flew against the perfect daughter I was trying to be. But being gay was something I could understand. It wasn't great, I wasn't happy about it, but it was something I had a reference for. It wasn't until my freshman year of college when a friend told me about the difference, but how she understood the difference between sex and gender. She explained that gender is more of the role you play in society, and I immediately said, that's me. I have a different gender than my sex. And she was like, no, you don't understand. And I was like, no, I actually think I do. But she was the expert, and so I kind of took what she said as face value. But a little part of my brain held on to this. I eventually came out as gay, much to the anger of my parents, who threatened me with stopping paying for college, something that would mean I'd have to drop out. They told me to go get diagnosed with the illness of being queer. They forbid me from telling anyone in my family. Their embarrassment of who I was caused me to enter into the deepest depression of my life. Still, life moved on. I moved to San Francisco, the promised land. Got a girlfriend. They eventually adjusted to that, to their credit. They even came to my wedding to this girlfriend after we moved to Boston. All the while, this nagging thing was building in my brain. Am I transgender? Am I really a man? I've never tried so hard to reject anything in my life. I was afraid I'd lose my parents for good. My wife at the time, which is not my current wife, was a proud lesbian. She wasn't too keen on the idea either. It was the lowest point of my life. I would lie in bed, my stomach in knots, knowing a truth I couldn't bring myself to say. Finally, a therapist said to me, "You're a man." Maybe therapists shouldn't say that, I don't know, but finally gave me the permission to recognize who I was, who I knew to be inside. I mailed my parents a letter. My wife eventually left me. Not that I can blame her. My relationship with my parents remained the same, strained but intact. And I couldn't stop thinking about how what I was doing was wrong in the eyes of society. I'd gone against what I was supposed to be. How could I do this? What was wrong with me? But it was excruciating. But then, joy. Immense joy. I was reborn. As scary as it was, my heart soared whenever somebody called me he instead of she. I loved hearing my voice drop and my face sprout hair from the testosterone I was taking. It was as if I had been seeing the world through these dark glasses, and now I was seeing it clearly for the first time. And as some who loved me cried for their grief of losing who I was, of not recognizing me, those friends who had been there for me all along finally saw that joy in my eyes. I was the man that God had intended me to be, or perhaps just the man that I knew that I was. And my life was infinitely better in that resurrection. This personal story of death and resurrection in my own life, the death of my dreams and ideas of who I was supposed to be, the death of my old self, of not to me, perhaps to those who knew me. In it, I resonated with Jesus' death and resurrection, his metaphorical death and resurrection, with the valleys we all go through in life, and the ways in which joy can come afterwards, the idea that we are changed by what we go through. Jesus' death at the hands of the state that didn't approve of who he was and what he did reminds me of the deaths of transgender people. Next, Benedict, who died after being attacked in a bathroom at their school. Yet the government doesn't connect the dots. Or the countless transgender people who are killed for their existence or kill themselves in a world that is trying to legislate them out of existence, as states pass laws that make it akin to child abuse to accept your child's transgender identity. My friends, it feels like we're in the depths right now. There are some in the Christian tradition who see Jesus' suffering on the cross as something that had to happen for him to be resurrected. There's a way in which me equating my experience of being transgender with Jesus' suffering and rebirth implies that transgender people should have to suffer to become who they really are. Friends, this is the opposite of what I'm saying. Remember, Jesus did not die for the sins of the world. He was killed because of the sins of the world. Womanist theologians, that is, Black Christian feminists such as Jacqueline Grant, provide us a framework for this. Jesus is there with us in our suffering. Just as his own suffering didn't need to happen, neither does the suffering of transgender people at the hands of a society that doesn't understand us. Transgender people deserve all the joy of becoming who they truly are. They deserve to be seen as holy and sacred and beloved children of God, as teachers and ministers and parents and children. They deserve to be celebrated. We deserve to be celebrated. And that is what Transgender Day of Visibility is about. Celebrating those of us who are here. That is what Drag Easter is about. The joy of celebrating all the ways we play with gender. And of course, doing drag and being transgender are not the same thing. But we celebrate here today the holy Jesus, the drag queen, the radical, the ways that we can play outside of the box of who we're told to be. And so as we celebrate this rebirth of Jesus today, his resurrection, this metaphor for life after death, let us celebrate the beauty of all transgender people who have found that life, the joy of a true life, and still work towards a world where suffering doesn't have to happen to bring this about. And it starts by loving and celebrating the transgender people around you and yourself, if you are trans. Honoring that they know their gender best, continuing to support laws that let people live as who they are. Recognize that being trans is part of the beauty of human experience. So I gave a sermon kind of like this at a Christian church about 10 years ago. And the minister said to me, "Are you comparing yourself to our risen Lord?" Yes, I suppose I was. Only in that I was reminding them all that transgender people are holy. And a man came to me afterwards and said, "To be transgender, it's scriptural, it's biblical. It's the story of Jesus." Perhaps Jesus was a trans kid after all. In churches across the world this morning, they are saying, he is risen. But let us say we are risen. We will rise again and again and again. May it be so. Let us say together, amen.